Billionaire rejected his poor daughter-in-law, but what she did for his son melted his heart. Sarah Mitchell stood at the mahogany doors of the Blackwood mansion, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn envelope. Inside was her last hope, a letter that could either save her husband's life or destroy what little remained of their family. The security guard's words still echoed in her mind. Mr. Blackwood doesn't see people like you. People like her. Poor, unworthy, unwelcome. But she had to try. For David, for their unborn child, for the love that had cost them everything. The first time Sarah Chen met David Blackwood, she was serving coffee at a small cafe near Harvard Medical School. He ordered a simple black coffee. But what caught her attention wasn't his order. It was the medical textbook he was studying with such intensity that he didn't notice his coffee growing cold. "Neurosurgery?" she asked, recognizing the diagrams as she refilled his cup. David looked up, surprised. "You know about brain surgery?" Sarah smiled. "My mother was a nurse. I grew up hearing about medical procedures over dinner. She always said the brain was God's most mysterious creation." That simple conversation sparked something neither expected. David, heir to the Blackwood pharmaceutical empire, found himself returning to that cafe every day, not for the coffee, but for the waitress who asked about his studies, who understood his passion for medicine beyond its monetary rewards. Sarah was different from anyone in his world. She worked 2 jobs to pay for her mother's cancer treatments. She read medical journals during her breaks, not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand what her mother was going through. She had a smile that could light up the darkest emergency room, and a spirit that no amount of hardship could break. "You know my father will never approve," David said one evening, 6 months after they'd started dating. "I'm not dating your father," Sarah replied simply. But Richard Blackwood's disapproval would prove more destructive than either of them imagined. Richard Blackwood had built his pharmaceutical empire from nothing, turning a small family pharmacy into a billion-dollar corporation. He had plans for his only son, plans that didn't include a penniless waitress with no social connections. "She's after your money," Richard declared when David announced their engagement. "Sarah doesn't even want me to buy her dinner most nights," David protested. "She insists on paying her own way." That's how they hook you. Playing hard to get, acting noble. Richard's voice was ice. "I've seen it 1,000 times. The confrontation that followed shattered the Blackwood family. Richard gave David an ultimatum. Choose Sarah or choose his inheritance, his trust fund, his place in the family business, everything. David chose Sarah. They married in a simple ceremony at City Hall, with only Sarah's ailing mother and David's best friend as witnesses. Richard didn't attend. He cut David off completely, no money, no contact, no acknowledgement that his son even existed. The early days of their marriage were harder than either had imagined. David had to drop out of medical school without his trust fund. He couldn't afford the tuition. He took a job as an EMT, working brutal hours for modest pay. Sarah continued waitressing while taking night classes to become a medical assistant. Their apartment was tiny, with pipes that groaned and windows that leaked during storms. But it was theirs. They painted the walls together, laughing as they got more paint on themselves than the walls. They ate dinners of pasta and hope, planning for a future where David would return to medical school and fulfill his dream of becoming a neurosurgeon. "I'm sorry," David would say on the nights when exhaustion and frustration overwhelmed him. "You deserve better than this." "I have everything I need," Sarah would reply, holding his face in her hands. "I have you." Sarah's mother passed away a year after their wedding. The medical bills had eaten through every penny Sarah had saved, and even with both of them working, they were drowning in debt. But Sarah never complained. She grieved quietly, channeling her pain into determination to build a better life. Then, just as things seemed to stabilize, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The joy of expecting their first child was short-lived. During a routine checkup at his EMT job, David collapsed. The diagnosis was devastating. A rare brain tumor, aggressive and growing rapidly. "There's a specialist in Switzerland," the oncologist explained. "Dr. Brenner has developed an experimental treatment. It's shown remarkable results, but..." But what? Sarah asked, gripping David's hand. The treatment isn't covered by insurance. The cost is substantial. Substantial was an understatement. The treatment would cost $800,000, not including travel and accommodation. For a couple living paycheck to paycheck, it might as well have been $8 billion. Sarah tried everything. She applied for medical grants, started crowdfunding campaigns, reached out to charities, but time was running out. David's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The doctors gave him 6 months without treatment. That's when Sarah made the decision that brought her to Richard Blackwood's door. Richard Blackwood's assistant had been instructed to turn Sarah away, but something in her eyes, perhaps the same determination Richard had once seen in himself, made the woman hesitate. "Please," Sarah said, "just give him this letter. If he reads it and still says no, I'll never bother him again." The letter was simple. "Mr. Blackwood, your son is dying. I know you hate me, and I've accepted that. But David is your blood. He's brilliant and kind, and everything a father should be proud of. He chose love over money, and I know that disappointed you. But hasn't he been punished enough? I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for your grandchild, who will never know their father if you don't help. Please, I'm begging you." Sarah. Richard read the letter in his office, surrounded by photos from David's childhood. The boy who'd wanted to be a doctor since he was 5. The son who'd volunteered at free clinics during high school. The heir who'd chosen love over fortune. He crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. With all conventional options exhausted, Sarah made a decision that would have broken David's heart if he'd known. She started working a third job, cleaning offices at night while 7 months pregnant. She sold everything they owned of value. Her mother's jewelry, their car, even her wedding ring. "Where's your ring?" David asked one day, noticing her bare finger. "Being cleaned." She lied, hating herself for it. But it wasn't enough. Not even close. That's when Marcus Chun, Sarah's estranged uncle, appeared. Marcus had built a successful import business, but his help came with a price. "I'll loan you the money," he said, "but I want a guarantee. Sign over your parental rights. If you can't pay me back in 5 years, the child comes to live with me and my wife. We can't have children of our own." It was an impossible choice, but watching David grow weaker every day, seeing the light fading from his eyes, Sarah signed the papers. The trip to Switzerland was a blur of airports and hospitals. Dr. Brenner was cautiously optimistic about David's case. The treatment was grueling. Months of experimental procedures, radiation, and recovery. Sarah never left his side, even as her pregnancy advanced. She slept in hospital chairs, lived on cafeteria food, and read medical journals to understand every aspect of David's treatment. "How are we affording this?" David asked during a lucid moment. "Insurance finally came through." Sarah lied again. "And the hospital has a payment plan." David was too sick to question further, and Sarah was grateful. She couldn't bear to tell him what she'd sacrificed. Against all odds, the treatment worked. David's tumor shrank, then disappeared entirely. Dr. Brenner called it one of his most successful cases. As David recovered, Sarah went into labor. Their daughter, Emma, was born on a snowy December morning. David held her with tears streaming down his face, unaware of the deal that hung over her tiny head like a sword. "She's perfect," he whispered, "just like her mother." Sarah smiled through her own tears, memorizing every detail of this moment, knowing that the clock was already ticking on the 5 years she had to repay Marcus. David's recovery was remarkable. Within a year, he was back to full health, working as an EMT while studying to complete his medical degree through a special program for healthcare workers. Sarah worked tirelessly, taking on extra shifts whenever possible, saving every penny toward the impossible debt. They lived simply but happily. Emma grew into a bright, curious toddler who had her father's eyes and her mother's smile. David often talked about the future, finishing medical school, opening a clinic in an underserved neighborhood, giving Emma siblings. Sarah listened to these dreams with a breaking heart, knowing that in 3 more years, she might lose everything. Richard Blackwood had built his empire on information. He had eyes and ears everywhere, which is how he learned about his son's miraculous recovery. Private investigators reported back. David was healthy, working, raising a daughter Richard had never met. But the investigators found something else. Records of Sarah's desperate attempts to raise money, her multiple jobs, the sale of her possessions, and most shocking of all, the loan agreement with Marcus Chun. For the first time in years, Richard felt something crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Richard decided to see for himself. He dressed down, something he hadn't done in decades, and went to the community clinic where David volunteered on weekends. He watched from the waiting room as his son treated patient after patient with compassion and skill. He saw Sarah arrive with lunch for David, saw her kiss him quickly before rushing back to her own job. He saw Emma, now 3, drawing pictures in the corner while waiting for her parents. "That's my daddy," Emma told anyone who would listen. "He helps sick people feel better." When David finally noticed him, the recognition was instant. Father and son stared at each other across the crowded clinic. "Richard," Sarah appeared at David's side, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see what my son has built without me," Richard said quietly. David's jaw tightened. "We don't need anything from you." "I can see that," Richard replied, and for the first time, there was something like respect in his voice. Richard might have left then, maintaining the cold distance between them, if Emma hadn't chosen that moment to run to Sarah. "Mommy, look, I drew our family." She held up a picture of 3 stick figures. "That's you and Daddy and me." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling despite her exhaustion. Richard noticed the dark circles under Sarah's eyes, the way her clothes hung loose on her frame, the tremor in her hands from exhaustion. This wasn't the gold digger he'd imagined. This was a woman destroying herself to save her family. That night, Richard's investigators presented him with the full truth. Sarah's arrangement with Marcus Chun, the impossible timeline, the certainty that she would lose Emma in less than 2 years. Richard stared at the reports for hours. His son's wife, the woman he'd rejected, scorned, and dismissed, had sold her soul to save David's life. And she'd done it all without telling David, protecting him from the guilt that would surely crush him. Richard appeared at their apartment the next evening. Sarah answered the door, immediately stepping outside to prevent him from waking Emma. "David's at work," she said quietly. "Please leave." "I know about Marcus Chun," Richard said simply. Sarah's face went white. "How?" "I know about the loan, the terms, everything." Richard studied her face. "David doesn't know, does he?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. "Why?" Richard asked. "Why didn't you come to me again? Why didn't you tell David?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Come to you? You threw your own son away like garbage, because he loved me. You made it clear what you thought of me. And tell David? So he could live with the guilt? So he could hate himself for surviving? No, this is my burden." "You sold your daughter to save my son," Richard said slowly. "I made a deal to save my husband," Sarah corrected. "And I'd do it again." For the first time in his life, Richard Blackwood found himself without words. Over the following days, Richard learned more about the woman he'd dismissed as a fortune hunter. He discovered that Sarah had graduated at the top of her medical assistant program while caring for David, that she turned down a scholarship to nursing school because it would have meant less time to work and pay off the debt, that she'd never told David about the sacrifices she'd made, bearing the weight alone. He learned about the nights she'd gone hungry so David and Emma could eat, about the second job she'd hidden from David, telling him she was attending a book club when she was really cleaning offices until dawn, about the journal she kept, documenting every precious moment with Emma, knowing their time was limited. Richard had built his empire by reading people, by seeing through facades to the truth beneath. Now, finally, he saw Sarah clearly. She wasn't after the Blackwood fortune. She was the fortune, the treasure his son had recognized while Richard had been too blind to see. Richard made his decision on a rainy Thursday afternoon. He arrived at the clinic where Sarah worked, waiting until her break. "We need to talk," he said. "I have nothing to say to you," Sarah replied, trying to walk past him. "I'm going to pay off Marcus Chun," Richard said quietly. Sarah froze. "What?" The full amount. Plus interest. Emma stays with you and David. Sarah turned slowly, suspicion clear in her eyes. What's the catch? No catch. There's always a catch with you. Richard sighed. The catch is that I was wrong. About you. About everything. The catch is that I'm a foolish old man who almost lost his son forever because of pride. Sarah studied him for a long moment. David can never know. About the loan, about Marcus, about any of it. Agreed. And I don't want your money for anything else. We're doing fine on our own. I can see that, Richard said. But Sarah, you've been carrying this alone for too long. Let me help. Not for you. For David. For Emma. For the family I threw away. The payment to Marcus Chun was made quietly. The threat to Emma's future erased with a wire transfer. Sarah kept her promise not to tell David, but she couldn't hide her relief. She smiled more, slept better, and finally accepted the promotion she'd been turning down because it would mean fewer hours to work second jobs. Richard began visiting the clinic regularly, always when David was there. Slowly, carefully, father and son began to rebuild what pride had destroyed. Emma, with a child's innocent wisdom, accepted her grandfather immediately. Are you Daddy's daddy? She asked during one visit. Yes, Richard said, his voice thick. I am. Then you're my grandpa. I've wanted a grandpa forever. The hug Emma gave him was worth more than his entire empire. David discovered the truth the way truth often emerges, in pieces, accidentally, devastatingly. He was organizing papers for taxes when he found the loan agreement Sarah had hidden. The terms were clear, the signature unmistakable. The dates aligned perfectly with his treatment in Switzerland. When Sarah came home, she found him sitting at their kitchen table, the papers spread before him. Tell me this isn't real, he said, his voice broken. Sarah's shoulders sagged. She'd carried this secret for so long, and now, finally, the weight of it crashed down. I couldn't let you die, she whispered. You sold our daughter? You were going to give up Emma. I was going to do whatever it took to save you. And I'd do it again. The argument that followed was their first real fight. David was furious, not at the sacrifice, but at the secret, at the burden she'd carried alone. We're supposed to be partners, he said, in everything. How could you not tell me? Because you would have refused the treatment. You would have chosen to die rather than risk Emma. And I couldn't. I couldn't lose you. It was Richard who finally told David everything. How Sarah had come to him first, humbling herself before a man who'd rejected her. How she'd worked herself to exhaustion. How she'd sold everything she had, including her mother's last possessions. She never asked for anything for herself, Richard said. Only for you. Only for your life. David found Sarah at the park where she often took Emma. She was pushing their daughter on the swing, and for a moment, he just watched them. His wife who'd sacrificed everything. His daughter who'd almost been lost. I'm sorry, he said, approaching slowly. I'm sorry you had to carry this alone. I'm sorry my father made you feel like you had no other choice. I'm sorry I wasn't there to help you through it. Sarah turned, tears streaming down her face. I'm not sorry. Not for any of it. You're alive. Emma exists. We're together. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times. David pulled her into his arms, holding her as she finally let herself break down, releasing years of fear and stress and secret pain. No more secrets, he whispered. Never again. We face everything together. The truth, once revealed, began to heal wounds that had festered for years. Richard, witnessing the depth of Sarah's love for his son, finally understood what David had seen from the beginning. He began including Sarah in family decisions, seeking her opinion, recognizing her as the daughter-in-law he'd been too proud to accept. I owe you more than money can ever repay, Richard told her one evening as they watched David and Emma play in the yard. You don't owe me anything, Sarah replied. We're family. This is what family does. No, Richard said quietly. This is what extraordinary people do. And I was too blind to see how extraordinary you are. With the financial burden lifted, David was able to complete his medical degree. He specialized in neurosurgery, driven by his own experience to help others facing similar diagnoses. Sarah finally accepted that nursing school scholarship, studying while David watched Emma in the evenings. Richard established the Sarah Blackwood Foundation, providing financial assistance to families dealing with catastrophic medical bills. He insisted on naming it after Sarah over her protests. "You taught me that love isn't measured in dollars," he said. "Let me use my dollars to spread that love." The foundation's first recipient was a young mother whose husband needed cancer treatment. Sarah personally delivered the check, remembering her own desperate situation years before. On Emma's 5th birthday, the entire family gathered at the Blackwood mansion, the same mansion Sarah had once been turned away from. As he watched his granddaughter blow out her candles, surrounded by the family he'd almost lost, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, sitting beside him. "How wrong I was," Richard admitted. "I spent my whole life believing that money was power, that wealth was security. But you showed me that real power is in sacrifice. Real wealth is in love." "You weren't entirely wrong," Sarah said gently. "Money saved David's life, but love made that money possible." Richard nodded. "You melted my heart, Sarah, not through manipulation or schemes, but through the simple act of loving my son more than yourself. You showed me what I'd forgotten. That family isn't about bloodlines or bank accounts. It's about choosing each other again and again, especially when it costs everything." Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand, they told her the whole story. She listened with wide eyes to the tale of her mother's sacrifice, her father's illness, and her grandfather's transformation. "So Mommy was going to give me away to save Daddy. Your mother was willing to break her own heart to save mine," David explained. "But your grandfather made sure that didn't happen." Emma was quiet for a moment, then hugged Sarah fiercely. "You're the bravest person in the whole world, Mommy." "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, holding her daughter close. "I was just a woman who loved her family. Sometimes that's all the bravery you need." Richard lived to see David become one of the country's leading neurosurgeons, specializing in the same type of tumor that had threatened his life. He watched Sarah graduate nursing school with honors and join David's practice, where they worked together to save lives. He saw Emma grow into a compassionate young woman who understood that privilege came with responsibility, who volunteered at the same community clinic where her parents had worked, who treated everyone with the respect her mother had been denied. But most importantly, he learned that the greatest fortune he'd ever possessed wasn't his pharmaceutical empire or his billions in the bank. It was the moment Sarah had stood at his door, willing to humiliate herself for the chance to save his son. It was the love that had transformed their broken family into something beautiful. On his deathbed, Richard called Sarah to his side. "I need to tell you something," he wheezed, his voice weak but clear. "That day you came to my door, I threw your letter away. I turned my back on my own son's life because of pride. But you didn't give up. You found another way. You saved him despite me, not because of me." "Richard," Sarah began, but he raised a trembling hand. "Let me finish. I've rewritten my will. Everything goes to the foundation with your name on it, because you taught me what wealth is really for. Not to divide families, but to save them. Not to measure worth, but to create it." Sarah held his hand, this man who had once rejected her, who had become not just a father-in-law, but a true father. "We forgave you long ago." "I know." Richard smiled weakly. "That's how I know I was wrong about you from the beginning. Only someone truly wealthy in spirit could forgive so completely." Richard Blackwood passed away peacefully, surrounded by the family he'd almost thrown away. At his funeral, hundreds came to pay their respects, business associates, rivals, politicians. But the eulogy that moved everyone to tears came from Sarah. "Richard Blackwood was known for building an empire," she said, standing at the podium in the church, filled to capacity. "But his greatest achievement wasn't measured in stock prices or market shares. It wasn't admitting he was wrong. It wasn't choosing love over pride. It was in learning that the poorest person can possess the greatest wealth if they have love, and the richest person can be bankrupt without it." She paused, looking at David and Emma in the front row. He rejected me once for being poor, but in the end, he realized I had something money couldn't buy, the willingness to sacrifice everything for family. And when he embraced that truth, he became truly wealthy for the first time in his life. As Sarah spoke, she thought about the journey that had brought them all here. The desperate woman at the mansion door, the dying husband, the impossible choice, the secret burden, the unexpected redemption. Love had conquered pride. Sacrifice had melted the hardest heart. And a family that had been broken by money had been healed by something infinitely more valuable. In the end, the billionaire who had rejected his poor daughter-in-law learned that she had given him the greatest gift of all, not just his son's life, but the chance to discover what life was truly about before it was too late. As Emma stood to speak about her grandfather, she said something that resonated through the church and beyond. My grandfather once believed that being poor made someone less worthy of love. My mother proved that being rich has nothing to do with money. But I wonder, how many families are broken right now because someone is measuring worth in dollars instead of devotion? How many Sarahs are out there, being rejected not for who they are, but for what they don't have? And how many Richards are there, missing out on the greatest treasures of life because they're too proud to see past a bank balance? She looked out at the assembled crowd, many of whom were wealthy, powerful, accustomed to judging worth by net worth. My mother melted my grandfather's heart by showing him that love is the only currency that matters. But here's what I want to know. Emma paused, her eyes moving across the faces in the crowd, landing finally on the camera broadcasting the service to thousands more. What would it take to melt yours? What sacrifice would finally make you see that the person you've rejected for being beneath you might actually be the one who could save you? And more importantly, will you wait until it's almost too late, like my grandfather did, or will you open your heart today? The church fell silent, the question hanging in the air like a challenge, like a prayer, like a promise that love could still conquer pride, if only people would let it. What would your answer be? Have you ever judged someone's worth by their wealth instead of their heart? Share your thoughts below. And if this story touched your soul, subscribe to Beyond Yesterday for more tales that remind us what truly matters in life. Because sometimes, the poorest person in the room possesses the greatest treasure of all. And sometimes, it takes losing everything to finally understand what wealth really means.